great pleasure to have a chance to talk to Alvy. I always start, Alvy, with where and when you were born.
I'm Alvy Ray Smith. I was born in Mineral Wells, Texas, in the U.S.
That's a very...
September 8th, 1943.
Great. And just tell me something. I know you are a genealogist, a very redoubtable genealogist, so we don't have to have all the details, but tell me something about your ancestry back to your grandparents or great-grandparents.
My family history, has turned out to be a complete surprise. The deep family history has turned out to be a deep surprise. We, as far as I knew, we were Texans, New Mexicans, with a branch that had come in from Australia somewhere. And, now that I've blown the genealogy back generation, 10 or so generations, I know that some of my ancestors came over in the 1620s, 1640 period as part of the settlement of New England. Others came from France, Huguenots run out by the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. There's an Irishman or two in there. And that's just my mom's side. I have really not discovered very much about my father's side. They seem to have come in from the south someplace and been in early Texas. So my ancestry that I sort of still really sense is my ancestry is Texas, all the way back to the Republic of Texas and the Battle of San Jacinto, as they pronounce it in Texas, where a small group of Texans fought off Santa Anna's giant army from Mexico and won independence from Mexico. Two of my ancestors are in that battle. That makes them heroes in Texas. And nobody else in the world knows what I'm even talking about. But they're noble heroes in Texas. But I didn't even know that until recently when I used DNA to take my genealogy back.
Your grandparents, then. Let's just get down to them.
Grandparents. I think this level would be great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents, the two fellows in the Battle of San Jacinto.
But if we come down to your grandparents, so tell me on the two sides.
Grandparents. So one grandparent was born in Australia, New South Wales. His family having escaped from the satanic mills of Lancashire to Australia in 1840. And my other grandfather comes from this line of Texas Smiths. I just know that he was a rancher.
Did you know either of them or their wives?
I knew the rancher. I didn't know the Australian man.
And did you know your grandmothers at all?
Yes. Well, I met my grandmother. I'm confusing great-grandparents with grandparents here. I did not know my grandparents on my mother's side. She was adopted when she was 2. So, they're just myths to me, passed down by the family. I knew my grandfather, but not my grandmother, who died when I was very young.
What was the occupation of all these grandparent generation?
Ranchers and farmers. Yeah, they raised orchards or cattle or did some, subsistence farming. All agriculture.
What about your parents?
They both were born in New Mexico. My father was born in a very small town in the mountains of New Mexico called Mayhill, and on raising cattle, basically, horses, very small. They had no money, very poor people. He was the first in the family to go to college. My mother grew up in a town called Tularosa, New Mexico, right on the edge of the vast desert where the first A-bomb was set off, and so forth. She loved history and eventually taught it in high school, junior high school in my hometown of Clovis, New Mexico.
And what about their character and how it might have influeed you?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about my parents because they both died just last year, or 2 years ago, I guess it is now. At 93 and 94, having been good people all the time. I liked them. And, I've always seen people disgruntled by their parents, and I could never understand it because I had a great time. Mother, in particular, influenced me in a way that only made sense years later by showing me art books and telling me how wonderful history was. And she wasn't skilled in either of those fields, although she could teach New Mexico history. But her interest in them made me interested in them. And Dad was a smart man, my hero. And I could never understand why he could be such a liberal person in this very conservative small town that we grew up in. And he did it somehow by just being friendly to everybody and not ever talking politics. I know that I was a concern to them because they knew I was very bright and they were afraid that I would lose the faith, Southern Baptist being the faith. And sure enough, I did. And my mother, in fact, was the cause, although I think she knew at the time. They had a book, not a library exactly, but one bookshelf full of books in their home, which is very unusual in the small town I lived in, for there to be books in the houses, right? Most of these were their college books. They'd both gone to college. But there was this one interesting book in there called Oriental Philosophy. So I pulled that off the shelf one day, and my mother said, maybe you shouldn't read that.
How old were you?
I don't remember, but it must have been teenage or early teenage, like 13 or something like that. But she couldn't stop me. It's just not the thing to do, is to stop your child from seeking knowledge. And it basically had that effect because I learned about other religions whose stories were just as rich and good as the Christian version is, right? And it started making me ask all the questions, and by the end of the year I had basically started the path toward complete loss of faith.
So you were probably 12, 13.
Yeah, I remember I was 13 when that happened because I remember saying to myself, Alvy, this is a very important year. Remember this. You're 13 and you just started doubting all the stuff they've been telling you about religion.
Would you have been baptized, Baptist?
Oh, yes, indeed. Full immersion.
Now, later on?
No, in the Southern Baptist version of Baptist, immersion is a sign that you've been made a member of the church.
Yeah.
It doesn't save you from hell and all that, but it makes you a member. It's one of the things you do to say, I'm a member of the church. You become a voting member.
Yeah.
It's a public announcement that you're a believer. So that happened when I was 11. And almost immediately I invalidated it. I think, though, by Baptist standards, once a Baptist, always a Baptist, or something like that. I probably still am one.
What's your first memory, concrete memory? At what age were you?
Oh, interesting. The memory that comes to me as the first, and I don't really know that it is, was looking out through a fence at the desert in a town called Las Cruces, New Mexico, where my grandfather lived at the time on a little subsistence farm. So there was the yard with mulberry trees in it, cow, sheep, stuff like that. But on the other side of the fence was the desert. It's not stark desert. I mean, it wasn't just sand. It had mesquite bushes all over it and cacti and horny toads, we called them, lizards. They were flat and wide and flat. And there was glass out there. There was glass out there that had turned colors because of the exposure to the very hot sun. in southern New Mexico. That's what I believe was my earliest memory. How old was I? Well, we lived in Las Cruces. We left there when I was 2. So could I really remember 2? Maybe it was a year later, 3, something like that, because I don't really think I can remember 2, but
it's possible.
Yeah.
Where was your first school?
Well, I grew up in Clovis, New Mexico, so I went through all my public school training in Clovis, New Mexico, which is 8 miles from the Texas Panhandle. Some people have heard of Lubbock and Amarillo, Texas. Clovis, New Mexico forms an equilateral triangle with 100 miles on the side. And that triangle is nearly entirely in Texas, except for the little tip that sticks out into New Mexico, with Clovis at its apex.
Do you remember when you were 5, 6, 7, 8, any particular hobbies you had? What your interests were? Were you a collector of things? Were you
Oh, I was a mad collector. I collected stamps. Seems like everybody collected stamps. All boys did. So I collected stamps. But I generalized the idea to not just postage stamps, but to... We had the stamps when I was young called savings stamps. You fill up a book full of savings stamps, you could turn them in for merchandise. As far as I was concerned, that was a stamp too, so I collected... I collected cigar bands, which is an unusual one. I came up with a way of displaying them.
So you had a little museum?
I had a little... Well, they were albums, the way I thought of it more. I guess you could think of a museum. It was I was really proud of this unique collection.
Were you in sort of natural history? Did you wander around in the countryside and fish?
I could hardly avoid natural history. My father was a botanist, and he was in love with the outdoors. And he made me in love with the outdoors. It's probably his greatest contribution to me. He had a secret desire to be a park ranger in one of the national parks. And because of the realities of the war, World War II, and a young family, he had to take a real job. A mundane job, let's say, instead of real. But you could see he never lost. He tried to show me the wonder of the national parks and national forests, and why one would want to spend one's time there. And I got it, right? I wanted to too. It was this magical place. But his specialty in college was botany, and he had made an entire botanic collection of all the wildflowers in New Mexico, all of them. It was many years later when I said, "Does that include marijuana, Dad?" He says, "Yes, it did." Yes, it did. And he had even discovered a new species of mushroom that's named something Smithii.
Lovely. What was your first proper school? I mean, sort of the 8-year-old school. I don't know how it divides.
Okay, it's called primary school or elementary school, I guess. Was called James Bickley. It was just an ordinary school in an ordinary town.
Do you remember any of the teachers?
Sure. I remember all my teachers.
Really?
Sure.
Were there any in that school that particularly influenced you, do you think?
Yes, Mrs. Grinslade. See how'd this go? I had Miss Beasley, Miss Franks, Miss Stanislaw. Mrs. Grinslade, I can't remember which grade it was exactly that I got her, but I liked her so much that I made sure for the next year I got in her class. And my parents used to tease me about all the shenanigans I pulled to get into her class. You know, I'd see, apparently they were just assigning people randomly to her class, and I would get close to and realize I wasn't going to be on the flip of the coin, so I'd get back in line again until I was in her class. So I had her for 2 years.
What did she teach?
She taught literature. It turned out to be her husband who was the main influence on me at the time, because he taught biology. He taught me the elementary. One of his requirements was we had to learn the alimentary canal from mouth to anus with every chemical involved and all the enzymes and everything. Just it was great. What a way to learn the human body. It was fantastic. And she challenged me to read. She discovered I was a voracious reader. She had a set of history books called the Landmark series, which is pretty lousy history actually, but it's what we had in this small town. And I, of course, read every single book in the series.
And then you went on from there to secondary, or what?
Yeah, the next school we go to in Clovis is the junior high school, called Marshall Junior High, for 3 years, and then 3 years in high school.
So the junior high, were there any teachers again who?
Yes, junior high school, I met Mrs. Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins, she was probably not a Mrs. Don't really know, wasn't aware of those things at the time. Ms. Jenkins taught algebra. And one day she had explained how to solve a couple of quadratic equations. And then she put on the board a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and said, okay, I want you to solve this equation, and walked out of the room. So I did. She walks back in and said, who's got the solution? I said, well, I do. And she said, you could tell she just didn't believe it. And she read it, and, basically I'd solved the quadratic equation, just generalizing for what we'd done. And that put me on the fast path to mathematics, because she knew she had a bright one. So she helped me. So
from then on you were concentrating on mathematics, right?
Pretty much, although I was a band member all along. And I played the clarinet, and I was pretty good. We had contests, and I ended up in the state level clarinet playing, state level band. And at some point I had to decide, should I follow music or math and science? And I went with math and science. I was pretty sure I might have been a pretty good clarinet player for New Mexico, but not for the greater world. I kind of knew that.
What about other things? Sports? Were you a sporting type?
I was a terrible sportsman, except I could run.
But not team sports. And what hobbies do you have then when you were at junior high and senior high?
Hobbies, I don't remember any. I don't remember hobbies. It was
Passions.
Social time. You're learning girls and friends, and I do remember my male friends and I would go camping. This is one of the fun things we did. We'd go hundreds of miles away up into the mountains, the wilderness, they're called, wilderness areas. No vehicles allowed, no motorized vehicles allowed, and just spend a week out in the woods. Just love those periods. Yeah.
Your father didn't go with you there?
No.
Park ranger. By that time you were just not interested in religion, or were you fighting against it?
No, I was still fighting it. It took me quite a few years to completely argue. I mean, that's a lot to... It was hammered into me, twice on Sunday and once on Wednesday. For the rule in my home was, if you live in this house, you go to church. Well, I didn't want to move out of the house. I wasn't that crazy. But, so I went to church, but I didn't,
What was your main objection?
Well, I couldn't understand the logic. I got so bored in church that I started reading the Bible, and I read it cover to cover twice, the whole thing, King James Version, of course, in Texas, New Mexico. And I realized this thing is just full of contradictions, and it bears little resemblance to what the preacher is telling us up there. And I just started saying, well, wait a minute, the whole thing just a talking snake? The whole thing is this. It was fabulous and fictitious. I just suddenly lost it. And once it goes, I don't think there's any way to get it back. It's gone. Now, I didn't lose my sense of awe and reverence of nature, which some might argue is a religion. I don't think so. I think it's just awe, which all human beings, I believe, are capable of. And I'm not sure where the awe-religion division is, if there is one.
What is your position now, do you think, recently?
Well, I'm atheist. I've had several experiences in my life I think of as religious, but religious person would not agree, of course. Surprisingly, some of these have to do with psychedelic drugs. LSD, for example, mescaline, peyote, where you go out and things. It's just a chemical you add to your body, so you know it's no supernatural force, and then it's going to wear off. So there's no having to believe in something else, and yet the experience of the world becomes so astonishing, breathtaking, marvelous, wonderful, highest point of your life, my life in this case, that I said, what's the difference between this and full religious experience? I can't imagine one. I may be wrong, but I can't.
So by the end of your senior high school, you were concentrating on math, science, and you presumably did pretty well at the exams, and then you went on to
New Mexico State University.
Yeah.
We were poor, but you could get into the state universities if you were a graduate of a high school, and the tuition was like $100. It was basically free. So, and I still hadn't weaned myself from home, frankly. So I went 300 miles.
Residential, you went away and lived there?
I went and lived 300 miles away in this town, Las Cruces, which I knew well because I lived there when I was a child. It's where I saw the desert out through the fence. Marvelous time to have been there. It's not, most people don't know this school, but the town is located at the foot of these glorious mountains called the Organ Mountains, because the early Spanish explorers thought they looked like organ pipes. And the mountains turn beautiful red at every sunset, every day. It just becomes, just as King's Chapel has become part of my everyday world here, the Organ Mountains were part of my ordinary world living in Las Cruces. And just beyond it, just beyond those mountains, is this special place on the planet called White Sands, which is one of the magical spots on the planet. Pure white sand, maybe 30 miles by 50 miles of 40 or 50 foot pure white sand dunes. When you enter the White Sands, you know you're there when everything has turned white except the sky. The road is white, the earth is white, everything is white. It's white. No plants, just white sand, except for this astonishingly blue sky. That's one of those spots where, is that much different from religion? I'm not sure. That's really special. So I grew up going to that place. That was one of those places you go and refuel, spiritually refuel. There's also a missile range there. So so let's see, how can I draw this? Here's Las Cruces, here are the Organ Mountains, here's where the first atom bomb was set off, here's the glorious White Sands that I told you about, and here's the White Sands missile range. So the military basically owns this vast desert and shoots missiles off there all the time. It's their missile testing range. For example, Wernher von Braun was brought there at the end of World War II with his V-2 rockets to teach, basically so the American scientists could learn what he knew. So I was there then, so I must have seen these V-2s being shot up. So I grew up with rockets going off, arcing across the sky. I heard first A-bomb go off. Science was, high tech was in the air. It didn't occur to me till later that most people didn't grow up with that experience. while I was going to school at the college there, the lunar excursion module was being built there for the moon. And I learned about computers there. So this is the early 60s.
Yes, I was going to say about 62.
I think I went 61 through 64, roughly that. 61 through 65 maybe. So these scientists would come over from White Sands Missile Range and teach a course on this new thing called programming at the college. Well, we'd sort of been hearing about computers. I signed up for it, and as many people have, I fell in love with this awesome thing. I mean, I look back at it now, it must have been a silly machine compared to what we had now.
I wonder what it was. Do you know?
I know, I don't, but I do know an unusual thing is I learned the language Algol before I learned the language Fortran.
Really?
Everybody was learning Fortran because IBM was the big monopoly at the time. But this man came over and he taught us Balgol, actually, so it ran on a Burroughs computer of some sort, because it was the Burroughs version of Algol, and that's about as far as I can get. I looked it up once, though, and in order to do a Moore's Law, I said, look, I've got this laptop now, I know exactly how powerful it is, how much memory it has. I made my first graphics on that computer, that Burroughs computer I'm just now describing. So I actually went out, found out what it had to be, and got its specs, and did the computation, Moore's Law. Of course, every time I check Moore's Law, everything falls right on it. It's astonishing.
How much RAM did it have, or storage, or whatever?
I don't remember those numbers, but it was, like
tiny.
4K or 8K or something like that. Yeah, just tiny. Yeah.
What aspect of computers do you fall in love with? Was it the programming, the exactitude of it?
I think it's the exactitude of it. I like that. I like the fact that it's problem solving too. You're solving something. And I like the feedback. You know when you've got it right pretty quickly. You don't have to wait months and years. You know, and you can fix it right on the spot. I like that. It's probably some sense that I'm in charge of that, that complex thing. I mean, these were room-sized beasts at the time. Had no concept of Moore's Law at the time. It hadn't been 65. 65 was when it got expressed. It hadn't even been expressed yet. So we didn't know they were going to get smaller and more powerful. We had no sense of the awesome revolution that was to happen.
Were you using it in your course? I mean, you were doing physics?
Well, yes. Mostly no, because most of the professors didn't know about computers. There was one old professor in the EE, the electrical engineering department, who taught power engineering, transmission lines. And he realized that his subject was not very popular. So the way he raised interest in it was he introduced the computer to it. You solve problems using Fortran this time. So we sure enough, it worked for me. I signed up for power engineering, which I never would have signed up for, just so I could program. And it's the only way in town to get more programming experience. So that worked. Another important thing happened at this university for me was OpenStack library, and I would just prowl around this library through the stacks and see what I could find. And one day I came upon this fabulous section that had the complete works of John von Neumann, and another book that had a paper by this guy Marvin Minsky in it called Steps Towards Artificial Intelligence. And I flipped out. I mean, you mean this computer might be intelligent? What a concept, There was one other book. This will be important to you, Alan. Fraser's Golden Bough. And I started pulling, this was in several volumes, and I started pulling off this fabulous book and reading through, just as I suspected, all the stories that I've been raised to be Jewish and Christian stories were shared by all these other people in a completely different context. I went, it just added support to where I was already anyhow. But I did like the notion that, you know, I learned about the fire and the Winter King and all that stuff. It was a great surprise. People down there were so intent on you following the Christian way, Protestant Christian way, that nobody taught me about this stuff, or they could have, and nobody did.
Was the university a sort of Christian university or not?
No, not in any formal sense, but that everybody there was. Belonged to one Methodist or Baptist, or if you were of Hispanic descent, Catholic. But that was it.
You said you found this paper by Minsky. We'll get on to artificial intelligence later, but you did meet Minsky later, didn't you?
I did. He's a friend all his life, and he died recently, as you know. And I found myself writing I don't know obituary exactly, but an honorific, whatever the right word is, an honorary statement. I said I just felt impelled to do it. The guy had come in and out of, Minsky had come in and out of my life for decades, even though we never worked together, just in strange ways. I said, I'm going to at least write that down. It's important to me personally, whether it matters to anybody else or not.
What was he like?
He was a funny, friendly man, very, very, very smart. He sort of did genius. You know, he was a genius. He sat around and was a genius, but he was.
So we're continuing in another location because Kings are having their summer party and practicing their acoustics. So we moved into inner room here, and we were just about to hear about Marvin Minsky. So if you could tell me again about Marvin.
Well, yeah, as you may recall, earlier in this interview, I met Marvin first informally by stumbling across his paper in New Mexico. His paper, Steps Towards Artificial Intelligence. I don't believe he coined the term, but it was a very early use of the term artificial intelligence. I read it, I was fascinated, and I was so fascinated, in fact, by it that I went to Stanford University to learn about it for my graduate work. And once I was there, I started questioning AI, how fast it was going to happen anyhow. And Marvin Minsky came for a visit, of course, from, there were two centers of AI at the time, or maybe three, but the two that I knew of were MIT, where Marvin was, and Stanford, where I was with John McCarthy. Marvin came on a visit. Somehow or another, we ended up having a pizza together in the Stanford Shopping Center. And I screwed up my courage and asked him, how did he logically get from what we knew today to intelligence? I couldn't get there. Just by thinking I couldn't get there, and I thought I must somehow just be missing some very important point. And I said, you must know and understand because you've devoted your entire career to this subject. And he looked at me in the eyes and he said, perhaps you don't have to, how do you put it? Perhaps you don't have to know in order to practice, or something like that. He basically was saying, I don't know either, is the way I took it. I don't know either, but that's not stopping me.
Sounds religious to me.
Well, it gave me what I needed not to pursue AI. We said, okay, if that's where Marvin Minsky's at, then I can see why I haven't understood the pathway. And somewhere in there, what actually closed the deal on AI at the time for me was I had another professor. I had John McCarthy teaching me Lisp, and I had Ed Feigenbaum teaching memory models. And Ed Feigenbaum in a lecture one day said something about artists that was not kind. He said, well, artists, we don't care about that kind of mind. And I'm saying to myself, wait a minute. He just cut out of his research field the humans I'm most interested in, the artist. Something's wrong here. And came to the conclusion fairly rapidly that AI, at least in the mythical form I had at that time wasn't going to happen in my lifetime. I guess what is the mythical form that somehow we would actually understand how this works in some kind of using the theories and forces that we know today. That's explanation of how that works is, I think, what I was looking for and still haven't found. Still the best problem in the world. How does this work? And started casting around for something else to do. But I'm kind of tickled. I look back, I said, I was right there at the very beginning of AI. I know I flabbergast people now by saying, I knew Marvin Minsky when he started, when he had just written that paper. And I learned lists from McCarthy, and you can see the young student's mouth drop. It's like I've just spoken God's name. And then Marvin, okay, back to Marvin. Very nice gentleman. To me, he spoke honest. He spoke truth to me instead of trying to just give me a sales pitch. So I changed subjects, PhD subjects, to computation theory.
How far into your course was this?
2 or 3 years. Several things happened. One was that I almost got kicked out of Stanford graduate program because of my long hair. This is the high hippie time in San Francisco Bay Area.
67.
Yes, that was the summer of love. I was there in 65, 66, 67, 68. No, 1 year off. 66 through 69. So I walked right into the summer of love and fell in love with it. And this was Vietnam War time, remember. It was very important to stay in graduate school. Otherwise, they sent you to Vietnam and you got killed. Very important to be in graduate school and get the exemption that at that time you could get. I went in for the qualifying exams. Interrupt the interview right here. So I was having doubts about AI. Couldn't find a place to go there anyhow. And I went to take the PhD qualifying exam, the quals they're called at Stanford. You have to pass through those before you even start the program. So the way the qualifying exams worked at Stanford at the time, each student had, I believe it was 10 minutes each with 8 professors, perhaps the other way around. And that's one-on-one in the professor's office. I went into Professor Skilling's office, the oldest man on the faculty, the electrical engineering faculty. And he took one look at me and he said, "That hair is unfortunate. It's down to here. And he gave me a 0. And he blackballed me out. He blackballed me out of the PhD program. On a subject I knew really well because I'd worked for several years in an antenna laboratory in Las Cruces, New Mexico, designing antennas for the rockets being shot at White Sands Missile Range, and actually testing the antennas on a range, a test range. So not only designed the antennas, but experimented with them and made modifications so they were better. And they actually flew these antennas. And I was in love with electromagnetic theory. It's one of the most beautiful theories I'd run across. Didn't ask me a question, it gave me a 0. So I was distraught. A small kid from a small town. I'm just running into wall after wall. I guess I'm not cut out for this. So I decided to go for an interview trip to Los Angeles, to a company called Computer Science Corporation, I believe.
So you were turned down by Stanford? They wouldn't let you?
Well, I was blackballed on the qualifying exams, which doesn't mean I was out, but it meant I had to spend another year doing it again. Doing it again.
Yeah.
with uncertain outcome.
Okay.
So I didn't know that particular professor wasn't going to be there the next year, which might have helped. So I went on this interview trip, programmer's job. I was so good. I just aced you gave a little quiz, which turned out to be equivalent to programming Turing machines. I could program Turing machines right, left, and did it all the time. Nothing to it. Well, it astonished the people at this company. They thought this test was so difficult. If you passed it, you could program anything. Well, that's true. If you could, you could. And I went, oh, you're pretty smart. They just told you were really smart. So I went back to the campus, and as luck would have it, one of those astonishing pieces of luck was that this young professor, Ed McCluskey, from Princeton, approached me. Now, Ed McCluskey, Stanford was trying to seduce him to leave Princeton and join Stanford. Ed McCluskey had long hair by the standards of the electrical engineering department. He had sort of Beatles length hair, like shorter than what I have on right now, but sort of like here. Considered long hair. All the rest of the double E professors had crew cuts, right? He approached me, he said, "Do you know who I am?" I said, "Sure, we all know who you are." He said, "Well, if I decide to stay, I'll need a graduate student. Are you interested?" He said, "What they did to you is just completely unfair." That was it. Just, somebody reached out. All you need sometimes is for somebody to reach out. And that's what turned me around, made me stay. He did not turn out to be my advisor. He was on my committee. I chose a man named Michael Arbib, who had written a book called Brains, Machines, and Mathematics, all three of my favorite subjects in one title. And I did a thesis on cellular automata theory, which brings me back to Marvin Minsky, because one of the things I proved was that one-dimensional cellular automata are computation universal. So I had to understand all the computation theory. Guess who had written a book on computation theory? Marvin Minsky. Computation, Finite and Infinite Machines, I think was the name of the book. Beautiful little well-written book. And I used it again and again and again. So, of course, when I would go back to visit MIT, I would stop in to see Marvin, now in a new guise. He's Mr. Computation instead of Mr. AI. Of course, he's still doing it all. I remember one time being there with Marvin. He brought me over to his home, which is this wonderful place, full of books. You could hardly walk through the rooms for the stacks of books. You kind of had to wade your way through. Every room was like that. Just junk everywhere. But meaningful to him and his wife. Dear wife, Gloria. I guess one of the ways I measure men is how good a wife they choose. He had this wonderful wife, how well he tried. She's treated really like Gloria, too. So Marvin took me out with several of his graduate students to dinner somewhere. Danny Hillis was one of his graduate students, the one I remember. There were several, but Danny Hillis, who would build a supercomputer later, was one of them. And we're all chatting like students do, just chat. And all of a sudden I realized Marvin was down at the end of the table all by himself, just talking away. And I kind of looked, he wasn't talking to anybody, he was just talking. And I kind of looked over to Danny, shouldn't we he says, that's just Marvin being genius. He just does that all the time. And it clearly didn't upset either party. Just Marvin was plenty happy to be spouting ideas even though there was nobody to receive. And the graduate students knew it didn't seem to harm his ego not to be paying every moment attention to it. So I don't know what that means, but to me it meant he's got so many ideas spewing out of it. It doesn't matter if only 10% of them take, that. And then The next time, so that's like 2 major encounters of 2 forms of Marvin. The third time is still a time I can't explain. I had a couple of lung operations. It's one of the reasons I'm having so much trouble with the pollen here in Cambridge, because I have 1/3 lung capacity resulting from these operations. They were strange, unexpected, the doctors still don't know how it happened, operations. And the first one happened in Marin County. I was taken care of, took me a month to recover. I said, well, what was that? And they explained to me what it was. It was a bacterial colony inside my pleural sac that had choked off my lung. I said, okay, how did the bacterium get into the pleural sac? There's no opening. He said, well, we don't know. We've never seen this before. We've read about it in books. Some of the best doctors in the country right there. Said the only time we've ever heard of this was Skid Row bums swallowing their own vomit. Will it happen to the other lung? Was my next question. Not a chance. This is so rare. 1 month later, I'm on the ferry going to North Vancouver when the second lung got hit by the same thing. So I go into a hospital in North Vancouver, Canada. Nobody knows I'm there. And I get a call from Marvin and Gloria Minsky. How am I doing? What? I have a theory how it happened, but it's just like they did it is the most important part. They reached out to somebody who was in trouble. Probably says more about him than anything else. It completely endeared the both of them to me forever. And then the relationship continued by these annual conferences called EG, Entertainment Gathering, held once a year, every 2 years, I believe, by a friend of mine, a kid that I had hired at Lucasfilm, and who had lived in Minsky's house while he was a student. Has these annual gatherings. They're kind of like TED conferences, except they're more about entertaining and music than general subjects. Marvin, Minsky, and Gloria were at every one of these. They always occur in Monterey, California. Marvin and Gloria were always there because Michael would always invite his beloved friends from MIT. So I'd run into them there and we would compare notes and stay on track, keep in touch. So, and then suddenly he died. And I just wrote this. A friend in Los Angeles said, Alvy, why don't you write all that down? And I'll post it. I know the family really well and I'll give it to them. So I did. No, kind man. Like I said, I never pursued AI any further after that. I've followed it. Just, it's one of my abiding interests. But I never practiced it. In computation theory, I don't practice anymore either. So
what happened after the computation theory thesis?
I got a job as a professor. I got my PhD, and I got a job at New York University. Working in the department of a man named Herb Freeman. And the story I'm about to tell you, I didn't know at the time. I just learned it this last week as I'm writing my chapter 7 for my book. Herb Freeman was actually Herbert Friedemann, originally, born in Germany. And he escaped the Nazis with the help of Albert Einstein. His family realized they had to flee, but they couldn't get young Herbert out of the country because the Nazi doctor said he had TB. He didn't, but it took these 3 letters from Albert Einstein to get them to retest him and let him in. So in 1938, he makes it into the U.S. and saved. He got saved. He became one of the earliest computer graphics people in the world, and my chairman. So I was teaching at that time. I taught an AI course, I remember, in his department. I taught computation theory, the things I knew, cellular automata. I was pursuing cellular automata at this time. There was this thing called the game of life that was really hot during this period, which was the cellular automaton. Do you know the game of life? The game of life was made famous by Scientific American magazine. Martin Gardner had a column in there that I read all the time I was growing up, called Mathematical Games, I think. I learned so much about math. So this Scientific American was in my little town's library, and I could open it up and learn about things. About science is really the only place. You learn a little bit in school, but I learned about topology, for example, and I learned about him. Martin Gardner always had these amazing little pieces of mathematical lore. Well, in this issue, I got this issue while I was living in New York City. Showed up, opened it right to the mathematical games section, and it's about the game of life, which is, you can think of the world as an infinite chessboard, and each cell is occupied or not, and the state of each cell changes depending on what its neighborhood looks like. It's called the game of life, and all kinds of elaborate patterns evolve out of this set of rules. Well, I looked at that and said, gee, that's a single cellular automaton. I just wrote my thesis on the general theory of CA, as we call them. I bet Martin Gardner doesn't know a thing about this general theory. I bet he doesn't know that John von Neumann invented it, for example. And I decided to call up my childhood hero, Martin Gardner, and tell him this, knowing that he just lived up the Hudson River from New York City. And I did. And he gladly took my call and said no, he had never heard of this subject. Could he come down and visit me, spend the day with me, because this was really important. This turned out to be the most popular subject they had ever had in a Scientific American magazine. I said, sure. I get to meet Martin Gardner, of course. So Martin Gardner shows up, New York, the NYU campus, a little wiry man. And he started apologizing almost immediately for not being a real mathematician. It turned out to be kind of a bogus claim, because I watched him. He claimed just to be a philosopher, not a mathematician. But I watched. He spent all day with me, and he wasn't taking any notes. And at one point, we went through a proof of a theorem. It's not a difficult theorem, but still, it had steps in it. No notes. And this is important because when the next day he sent me the next column, so the subject of Game of Life was so popular that the publisher said, we'll do another issue on that same subject. It'll be the cover story this time. And that's what Martin was writing, was that second follow-up article. And he sent it to me to vet it, to check the logic and all that. He had everything. I didn't have to change anything. He remembered everything exactly right. A couple of funny things is he was surprised by how hirsute all the males were on the campus. And I'm looking at him like, how could anybody be surprised by that? Especially the guy who wrote the annotated Alice. You know this book?
Did he? Yeah, I've got it.
Yes, Martin Gardner was the editor of the annotated Alice, the original one, which was de rigueur reading by every acid-dropping hippie in the world. he didn't. All of a sudden it hit me. He had no idea why his book was so popular. And I didn't have, there was such a large cultural divide there that I didn't feel free to jump across it and try to say. I just sort of remarked, I said, my goodness, it's like, that's too big a problem. I was, let it go. Yeah, Martin was famous for several things. Alice in Wonderland, mathematical tricks, debunking charlatans, and magic. He was sort of, he'd written magic tricks.
Oh, right.
He was really good at all of these.
A magician. Yeah.
So, he said the next thing you need to do, Alvy, is design a cover for this issue of the magazine. I'll submit several designs, and you should submit several designs, and then the publisher will choose what he wants for the cover. Well, I love, I'm half artist, so I love making book designs, book jacket designs. I do it all the time. I had just come back. I just returned from a cellular automata conference where I'd proved this theorem that says a one-dimensional cellular automaton can recognize a palindrome, that a string is a palindrome in time equal to the length of the string. Real easy theorem. But it's easy enough that I could illustrate it with color coding. So the first line, so I divided a page up into squares, and it was a space-time diagram. So the first line would be the state of the cellular automaton at time 0, time 1, time 2, time 3, time 4. And I color-coded in a palindrome, too hot to hoot, which I'd gotten from the New York Times crossword puzzle. The clue was, why don't owls live in the tropics? Too hot to hoot. So I color-coded that, and then I showed how the proof worked by sending signals down a page. And that sort of is it. I couldn't think of another picture to draw. And it won. It became the February 71 cover for Scientific American, much to the chagrin of Martin Gardner, because he had submitted designs by Stanislaw Ulam. Stanislaw Ulam and von Neumann had come up with this idea of cellular automata theory. They didn't finish it because von Neumann died. And Ulam had these beautiful little diagrams he had made to illustrate it, but they weren't selected because it turned out that the publisher of Scientific American was a palindrome freak.
So how did this lead on into what you're most
well, in a sense, that was computer graphics, wasn't it? It's like
this was the beginning of computer graphics.
You could think of that was a computer graphic. It wasn't. I didn't use the computer to make it, but it wasn't a big leap from there to. Now, Herb Freeman, the chairman of my department, was already in computer graphics, and in fact, and he knew I was an artist. Was one of the reasons he hired me. He wanted me to come and work in computer graphics theory with him. And I remember saying this so clearly. I said, Herb, if you ever get color, I'm there. Because it was still all black and white at the time. But I read all the theses of his other students, so I was starting to come up in the terminology, and I met some of the early players. Like one of the players I met was Robin Forrest, whom I visited. He's in Norwich now. And I visited him 3 times on this trip, sojourn in Cambridge. He's been one of my chief vetters. He knows all the players. He knows who did what, and so forth. So I've just been milking his brain about why did this happen here and why did that happen? Why isn't this person included in the usual story and so forth? Been a gold mine for me. I met him there and a couple of the early computer animators. Then I broke my leg skiing. I was up in New Hampshire skiing. Last run of the day, when you're tired as usual. I made one more run. These are all typical mistakes. And I was wearing a knitted cap, one of these long knitted hats. And on this run I was using, there was a patch of ice, and I knew that when I hit that patch of ice, I was just free falling, but I could regain balance really easily once I got through the patch. I'd done it several times. But this time, just as I hit the patch, I got blinded by this hat. Came down over my eyes, and by the time I was out of it, I wasn't prepared for this skier tumbling in from my left on a collision course. Couldn't do anything about it, and I just went right through him. He skied away. I had a broken femur. This spiral break, real nasty. I still have a 30-inch piece of metal in there. So, what that means is you have to disable the joint above and below the broken bone. Well, that means your hip had to be put in place and not moved. So basically I was stiff as a board for 3 months in a cast that went from my ankle to my nipples. And I found out who my friends were, because you're a baby, you have to be completely taken care of. And I had a lot of friends. I mean, I was astonished at how many people, those nasty New Yorkers you're always hearing about, not so. They stepped out to help me. But the long and short of it is I had 3 months with nothing else to do but think.
You've broken your leg and you're completely stiff for 3 months, so what happened then?
Well, first of all, my friends rescued me from this little town in New Hampshire where the leg had been broken. A bunch of Jewish friends, turns out, rented a special car because I couldn't bend. So I had to have it was a station wagon that had enough room that on the diagonal I could be put in there. And they brought me just because they realized I'd be lonely in this little town with no friends, bring me back to my home in New York City, and at least I could spend 3 months there with friends nearby. Beautiful, beautiful treatment. And they bring me into my house, and I see this kid, Roy Conovitz, putting up a Christmas tree. And he's never done it before, it's pretty obvious. I said, Roy, you ever done this before? And he was, no. But, again, I'm touched. So he thought enough to put up a Christmas tree for me just to make me feel good. Good Jewish boy. I said, well, I know this lonesome Christian lady in town who would just die and go to heaven if I called her up and said, come over and do a Christmas tree. So that's what we did. So anyhow, for 3 months I lay there and thought and thought and thought. And as people do, apparently, the story's not unusual. You rethink your life. What am I doing right? What am I doing wrong? And what I decided I was doing wrong was I was doing nothing about my art. I just stopped it.
What sort of art was it?
Well, I didn't really say earlier on, but I painted all my life, oil paints. And then I started painting on acrylics when they came along. My Uncle George in Las Cruces, New Mexico was an art teacher and an artist. And he showed me how it was done. As long as I wouldn't say anything, I could sit on the floor in his studio while he worked. The only member of the family that he would allow. And I would watch, and I learned how to prepare a canvas, stretch a canvas, lay it out, prepare the brushes, mix the paints, clean them in the turpentine, all that stuff. And I was surrounded by his art books. So I that was my art education, was watching Uncle George. So as soon as I could, I started buying, I knew how to do it, so I started doing canvases and oil paints and so forth and painting pictures. Even had an art show at the Stanford Student Union, where of course I didn't sell anything, but one of my paintings got stolen, so I took that as a big mark of success. But then I became a professor. I just dropped all art, making of art, except for the occasional book design or something. And lying there. I said, Alvy, you're not doing anything about your art, and that's wrong. That's part of you. You've let it drop. That's not good. And what are you doing? Well, you're feeding the Vietnam War machine with computer jocks. That's not right either. You should, when you come out of this cast, is drop out of academia and go to California where something good will happen.
How old are you by then?
Well, let's see, 30, more or less. PhD at 20, let's see, at 26, I think. And then 3 or 4 years at, so right there. I had no family, so I could actually consider doing this. So that's what I did. I was convinced. I mean, that logic is that deep. It's just a whim. It's just an intuitive guess. But it's total impetuosity, and I operated on it, which amazes me now. I look back and say, wow. I did. I came out of the cast. I went into the NYU and announced that I was dropping out, going to California. And the reactions I got were, I wish I could do that. One by one, each professor came and took me aside and said, wish I could do that. And I went, oh. What am I being told? I'm being supported, basically, in this crazy decision by everybody who had what apparently was, they had a house in Manhattan and a summer vacation home in Vermont, and kids in the private schools, and they were published authors, and they were right at the top of the academic ladder, and they were saying, I wished I could do what you're doing. Wow. So that just encouraged me, and I went ahead with it and went to California, and I'd saved money from my years as a professor, just enough to get by as basically a hippie, crashing on other people's floors. And one of the people I crashed with was a professor of computer science at Berkeley. And he says, you want to teach a class at Berkeley? And I said, sure. I need the money, right? So I taught a class on cellular automata theory at Berkeley. But I was really looking around for whatever this magic was that was supposed to happen to me when I got to California, and that teaching a class at Berkeley wasn't it. But then what it turned out to be was my best friend in the world at the time, Dick Schaup, whom I'd met on the east side of the country, had moved to California ahead of me and gone to work at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, which is now fabled, but nobody had heard of it at the time. And he said, Alvy, you've got to come over and see what I'm doing. I built a machine for artists. And you'll appreciate it, because he knew what I didn't really know what he was saying. But I went because he's a friend, and he had built a paint program on a computer. And of course, as soon as I saw it, I went, oh, this is it.
Paint.
Simulation of painting.
Yeah. It's not the famous Paint program. I mean, there was a program called Paint.
Paint was a Microsoft Paint, which is really, it's much later than what time I'm talking about.
Ah, right.
I'm talking about, when is this? Come on, dates. All right, I left Stanford in 69, 70, so it must be 74, somewhere in there. Okay. And Paint didn't come along until the personal computer in the 80s, right? So, my program is called Paint, by the way. My first Paint program is called Paint. But it really was the first Paint program. Except for Dick. He had written a Paint program for 8-bit pixels. So Xerox had the first color pixels in the world at 8 bits each, 256 colors. Nobody had seen this before. As soon as I saw it, I went, oh, this is it. How do I get on here at Xerox PARC? Well, they had no slots for hires, but I had enthusiastic supporters, one of whom is Alan Kay, whom you may have heard of, Dick and several others said, well, we can hire you with a purchase order to do art. What they wanted to hire me to do was to make art on Dick's painting, which Super Paint is what it was called, this system, is to make art on Super Paint and show it to the world, what this machine could do, because it's a new kind of art device. I said, perfect. I don't need much to live on, and I don't really care whether I'm officially hired or not, as long as I get access to this machine. So that's what happened. And for the next year, more or less, I just made art as fast as I could on this amazing machine. And just, like I said, nobody had ever seen colored pictures made out of pixels. Just hadn't seen it. I hadn't either. So every day was a new adventure, and I would experiment and record it, video, experiment, record it, experiment, record it. Now these recorders were the kind where it's thumb accurate. You know, you start the tape and it comes up to speed and it records, and then you stop and it slows down. And trying to edit things together is torture, but you could do it. And I made a piece called VidBits, a video piece. So it turned out to be one of the earliest pieces of computer video art. And I befriended an artist in San Francisco, David D. Francisco. He begged to come share the machine with me, but a lot of artists begged for that. But he begged in a better way. He made it clear that he loves machinery as much as art. He liked the technology just as much as the art. He wasn't technologically brilliant at all, but he liked details of technology. And finally I relented and said, well, why don't you come down one of these evenings? He was in San Francisco, and Park is in Palo Alto, 30 miles south, something like that. We'll just jam all night. It's a term I used. And what that meant was I would work on the machine for a while, working on this painting and doing all sorts of stuff. And then I'd just stop and he would take over. And he would take what I had. Then he'd stop and I'd take over. It usually was junk, but sometimes we just had so much fun. We're laughing and talking the whole time. We became dear friends, deep, deep friends. We still are. And David needed money. He's an artist. He started an artist. He said, why don't we do an NEA grant? That's the National Endowment for the Arts. He said, why don't we do an NEA grant about exploiting this new art form, this new medium? I had received National Science Foundation grants as a professor, and they were, 20 pages thick and 4 duplicate or something, just as tortured putting in a grant proposal. I went, I don't. He said, no, you've got it wrong. For the NEA, the proposal is 1 page long, and you send your work. That's it. I went, oh, okay, I'll do that. So we submitted, and it was in consideration for a grant proposal by the NEA when I got fired from Xerox. My purchase order got canceled. So I went in to see the boss to try to understand why I got fired. And he said, well, we've decided not to do color. And I looked at him, I said, the future's color, right? And you own it completely. You have it all right there in the next room. He said that may be true, but it's a corporate decision to go black and white. Okay. Okay. I guess I should point out that in the corner of that lab where Dick's machine was there, and I'm making art with David all night long, just having the wildest times. Over in the corner is a little black and white machine with this guy, William Newman, working at it. Max Newman's son. But I didn't know that at the time. Just this kid, William Newman. And he, at the time, had written the first textbook on computer graphics. He and Bob Sproul had written the text. The reason he was there is because he was famous for having written that textbook. And I remember my boss coming up to me one day and saying, don't you find Dick's super paint program difficult to use? Isn't what William's doing in the corner there much easier? And I just wanted to scream inside. I said, no. And then I became distressed for my friend Dick, because that meant his boss didn't know what he had, how good it was. It didn't have his back, didn't have his support. Anyhow, I left there with David. We're buddies now. We have an NEA grant proposal in the works. We just lost the one machine in the world that we could execute it on. We had to find the next such machine in the world. And the word we use is frame buffer. A frame buffer is a piece of memory that you can see. And this is back when memory was incredibly expensive. So basically we needed a quarter of a megabyte of memory with video attached to it. $100,000, $200,000 unit price. We needed one of those. Dick had built the first one. We're disallowed from that one now. So we had heard about this place called the University of Utah. Heard about it a lot because Alan Kay had come from there. We heard that the next frame buffer was being built at the University of Utah, or in Salt Lake City. So David and I jumped in my car and we drove over to Utah, Salt Lake City, find our way into the graphics department somehow. And long story short, basically we get told, my hair's down to here still, David's hair's out to there. We clearly are artists, we're not military contractors, right? And they looked at us and they said, you know, guys, we can't support you here. I mean, we can't support art. It's military funded. But there was a guy through here the other day, a rich man, a crazy rich man, who bought one of everything in sight. First question, did he buy the frame buffer? Yes. Now this product hadn't been built yet, but it was in the works. That's all we needed to hear. I said, well, okay, we need to go visit that man turned out to be from Long Island, New York. Alexander Schur. Who do we look up? I said, they said, well, there's a student, former student from Utah, just graduated. He wants to make animated movies with computers. His name is Ed Catmull, and he's given up on it happening here, so he's taken a job as computer-aided design in Boston. But he just got the call from this rich man on Long Island that just bought all this computer graphics equipment to come and join him on Long Island, which he did. So he's now in charge and the only person there of all this equipment, expensive equipment that this man wants to use to make movies. Well, it sounded exact. That's the ticket. I said, how are we going to find out about this? Well, one of the professors at Utah named Martin Newell, an Englishman. Martin Newell's famous for his teapot. He modeled his teapot as one of the earliest models, three-dimensional models. And that was such a precious database. For so long it got passed around from school to school. And anybody who had a new rendering algorithm in computer graphics would test it out on the classic teapot. That's Martin Newell. Martin Newell said, well, I'm going to go out and visit Ed Catmull on Long Island because he needs some help to figure out what's going on. Tell you what, Alvy, I'll call you as soon as I get back and tell you what I see. He did. And what he said was, if I were you boys, I'd get on the next plane. So we did. We got there and met one of the craziest people in my life, Alexander Schur. It's hard to explain his uniqueness. You and I, when we talk, one of us says something, the other one says something in response, and there's an exchange. It goes back and forth, kind of unwritten rules. Everybody knows how to play the game. It's called conversation. Not with Alex. Sure, Uncle Alex is what we called him. Alex would come into the room. You never knew when he was going to show up. 5 a.m., 5 p.m., 1 a.m. You just never knew. He would just show up, and he would be talking when he entered the door. Just a stream of consciousness. We called it word salad. Casey Stengel speaking, famous baseball player in New York, just talk nonsense. So what do you do when somebody comes in there just talking at you, but that there's no give and take? So I don't know. So I just started talking too. And after a while, I noticed that some of the things I had said showed up in his stream of words. Oh, okay, that's how it works. And believe it or not, it did work for several years. You could just start talking, and he'd keep talking, and before long you'd hear the same words, and you figure, well, it must have transmitted that idea, not knowing whether it really had or not, because you couldn't argue it. This man thought of himself as the next Walt Disney. He had a complete cell animation movie studio on the campus. So he had, this place is called the New York Institute of Technology. But it was a diploma mill. It was not a well-respected university. Remember, I had taught in academic circles of New York City for 4 years. I had never heard of this place. Basically, it was a private university, belonged to Uncle Alex. Designed for students who couldn't get into real colleges. They could live with mom and dad on Long Island, commute into this school and get some kind of diploma. You just stop a minute. So, the bookstore on this campus of New York Tech says it all. In its display window, it had tires and batteries. It sold auto parts because the students were commuters, and that was probably the most important thing on their minds. Kind of establishes Now that school has gone on to be, I think, a pretty good one, worldwide in its locations. So I think it's a much different place now, but then it was just a diploma mill run by this very wealthy man. What else? He had somehow cobbled together 4 adjoining estates on the north shore of Long Island, which is where the really, really wealthy people live. And he used the mansions on those estates as the buildings of his campus. Where did the money come from? We never knew. We would get some kind of runaround if we ever brought the subject up. We weren't allowed to ever see the budgets. We just spent, and he did it just on our say-so. So it was like a movie. It was like a wonderful movie. You would wake up every day on one estate, go work in another estate, go work in another mansion to do the video, come back to another mansion to do the graphics. I'll go see my girlfriend in another estate. For example, David, my artist friend from Xerox PARC, who had come out with me, and I shared a house that was the chauffeur's quarters above this 4 or 5 car garage on an estate that belonged to the family of David Rockefeller's wife. And we were, it was clear that we were the tenants. And they were not, they were the family. They had a special way called the honk of talking. Apparently you can tell which prep school somebody on Long Island is from by the tone of their honk. Tom Wolfe wrote a whole book about it. Very good to us, though. They let us live there for years. But the first visit, when we came out just to see whether it's going to make sense or not, Dave and I really spent our last money and jumped on a plane. Came to visit in a snowstorm, and walk in the door of the computer lab, and there's Ed Catmull and this other long-haired guy. Well, Ed Catmull didn't ever have long hair, but Ed Catmull and this other guy with long hair. We said, I remember we looked at the wrong guy and asked if he were Ed, and he says, "No, I'm Ed." So nobody knew anybody. And so then Ed became my partner for 16 years, and we co-founded Pixar together. Good Mormon boy. Grew up in Salt Lake City, was a missionary on Coney Island, of all places. Strictly a believer until he wasn't later in life. This crazy Alex, the one with the talks in the word salad way. Well, I had my videotape to show him. I remember that's how we started out this interview trip, was I wanted to show him my videotape. Well, it was the old U-matic format. Do you remember that? Mm-hmm. U-matic format. And he said, "Oh, I've got one in every room in my house." He lived in yet another mansion. So we go to his house. He says, "Now, be careful. We have guard dogs in the house, and if they see you, they'll eat you. So don't let them see you." So he moved the guard dogs out of the room that had a U-matic in it. Put in the tape. It didn't play. He said, "That's all right. I've got another one in the next room." Guard dogs had to be moved again. Did this 6 times where we found a U-matic that worked without being spotted by the guard dogs. And he loved it. I mean, I knew I was in. And I didn't have a job, but I wanted access to the machine. That's all I really wanted. Got it. And not David. David just had to hang out for about a year, wait for this NEA grant to come. It actually finally came. And the great adventure really began there. Basically, there were about 10 of us eventually, and we were making discoveries so fast and furiously that nobody wanted to go to sleep. You just don't sleep until you just absolutely have to, and then just as short as possible. Sleep under the desk, even if that you'll miss something if you go to sleep. Somebody will see something before you do. It was so exciting. And it was in this beautiful estate lands on the North Shore of Long Island. The Great Gatsby area of Long Island.
I was thinking of that.
And everything we touched, nobody had ever seen before. And sure enough, he bought this next 8-bit frame buffer. And then he came in one day and basically through that long process managed to ask, how do we stay ahead? We were the leading computer graphics lab in the world, right? We said, right. How do we stay there? I said, well, if you bought me 2 more of these 8-bit thingies, I could make a 24-bit frame buffer, and then we would have $16 million instead of just 200. And we can do anything then. Did he get that? I wasn't sure. He just walked away. Sure enough, a few weeks later, he came in. He said, I bought you 5 more of those thingies. So you'd have 2 of those RGB thingies. So these were the first full color pixels in the world. And we had more of it than anybody else in the world. The first 24-bit frame, so 24-bit frame buffers was the term. And we just started, everything we touched was new and original and worthy of a paper, and just going 90 miles an hour, trying to outthink, where should we go next, what should we develop next, and so forth. Meanwhile, we're working with these cell animators, these 100-person plus group of cell animators making a movie called Tubby the Tuba. And Alex's sort of mad idea was that somehow, and this is what he would say, is you can replace all the people and we'll just make the movie on the computer. And we went, no, Alex, it doesn't work like that. And don't say that. For goodness sakes, don't say that. These guys are scared to death of us for that very reason. They don't know that computers can't make art. We can help them, but we can't replace them. That's nuts. Well, we finally figured out that this guy was too crazy and incompetent to make a good movie. And we kind of kept our distance from that movie project, but we learned how animated movies were made, the whole difficult logistics of it all, which is really the secret. And we said to ourselves, you know, we should be the first people in the world to make a computer movie. We could see it, you know, we didn't know how we were going to get there, but we could see that that was something to be done in the world. And why not us? We're now surrounded by people from the movie business who don't know how to do it, but we should be able to figure it out pretty fast. So that's when we had the vision that took us 20 years to execute as Toy Story at Pixar. Went through 3 rich men on the process. One was this Alexander Schur, second was George Lucas, and third was Steve Jobs. I'm not sure we would have stuck to it if we'd known it was going to take 20 years. But probably we would have, because we were having so much fun as long as somebody was paying the bills, which they were up until we had to start Pixar because it was otherwise then. What I want to say here is just how exciting, wonderful, rich these years were, with surrounded by geniuses. Everybody was just so good. These people would find their way to us and say, "Look, I know what you're doing. I want to take part, and here's what I can do." And you look, it's usually pretty obvious when you had a hot one, right? So people are always asking me, "How do you make a creative team?" And I don't think I can tell you. You hire them. Being able to spot them, I guess, is the trick. But to me, it's fairly easy. They've got a glitter in their eyes, and they can talk your talk, and they know they're ready to. They're just ready, and you can feel it. So we surround ourselves with people like that, and we didn't have to do any bossing really, because everybody it's like an academic department. People just do what they're going to do. They can see what needs to be done, and they do it. Everybody gets a lot of glory and credit because that's the way academia works. We let everybody publish papers because that's where they better more than salaries. They wanted the kudos from their companions, their academic companions, and that probably would have worked forever if the man in charge had been a competent movie maker. But he wasn't. Tubby the Tuba came out, and it was so horrible that we were at the MGM screening studio in Manhattan. I think most of us went to sleep. We're in the front row. We all went to sleep to avoid this train wreck that's happening on the screen. Anything you can do wrong was wrong. There was lint on the frames and shadows under the opaque lines, and the story was no good. And this guy, Alexander Schur, had his name 6 times in the credits. It was like, the only young animator came up to us afterwards and said, "I just wasted 2 years of my life," and he was gone. Went to work for Ralph Bakshi. So we realized, even though we were living in this paradise amongst the estates on the North Shore, we had seemed like infinite money. This wasn't going to work. And about then, we got 2 phone calls. One of them came in from Francis Ford Coppola, called me, and the next day, George Lucas called another person in our group. I don't mean they themselves called, but they had their people call, right? Okay. So the person representing Coppola was somebody I did not trust. And so I didn't even make a positive noise. I just knew it wouldn't work. If that was quality people being hired there, it wasn't going to work. And sure enough, that group coked out a few years later. But then the Lucas group called. Now, Francis Ford Coppola is by far the greater director than George Lucas, by far.
Mm-hmm.
But he's also shaky financially. George Lucas might not be such a great director, but he's stable on the money side. Mm-hmm. And we knew we needed that second kind of financial backing because ours was a long-term, very expensive project. We had never heard of George Lucas. We had just heard of him because of Star Wars. I remember everybody jumping into my car, and I'm driving everybody into Manhattan to see Star Wars, his first movie, and just being, wow, that's different. We always thought it'd be Walt Disney that came to rescue us. Ed and I would go out to Walt Disney every year, out to Disney Studios. Walt was already dead. And basically on our hands and knees and say, can we, you should be used, we know what to do next here. Can we do it here? And all the technical level people knew exactly who we were and that was a great idea. But the leaders of the company were basically incompetent. For example, the president of Disney at this time was a professional football player who was qualified, so to speak, for presidency of Disney by being married to Walt Disney's daughter. That was it. And he was just running the company into the ground. Neither he nor his vice presidents could figure out what Ed and I are talking about at all. And they would just laugh us away. So these are all secret trips. Once a year we go out and pay homage to the great company. Meet them. We met all the early animators. These fabulous guys like Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnson. Learn the technical ropes inside and out. Meet all the technical level guys. All these relationships that eventually panned out, but we didn't know that, of course. We were just trying to get into Disney. They had the money. It was well known they had a lot of money. They had the artistic skill. Why aren't they the ones paying for this instead of this crazy man on Long Island? That's not who came knocking. It was George Lucas who came knocking. Ed and I very carefully crafted a letter that said, we're used to a really high standard of living. We want to come work with you, but we don't want to go downhill from what we're used to. Please send somebody secretly out here to just see what we're used to. So one day, and they agreed. So one day, the head of special effects of Lucasfilm shows up with a giant Star Wars belt buckle for the visit. And Ed and I are going, oh no. But nobody quite put it together what that belt buckle meant. And we had a great interview. I spent the evening with this director in Manhattan. He had never been to Manhattan before, and I said, well, I'm going in tonight like I often do, just to see what happens. Would you like to come along? He says, yeah, that sounds like fun. And so we just played around in Manhattan all night long till 4 a.m., just doing all kinds of things, going to coffee houses, experimental music, photographs. It was hot nights, so the water fountains were spewing and the kids were playing. And he was just, in his mind, he had heard about these things, but he had never seen them before. And we talked all night long. And by the next morning, I knew we were in at Lucasfilm. There's no question about it. And we were. But it took a little while to put that all together, but we pulled it off.
So you went to Lucas.
So we get to Lucasfilm. George Lucas, we thought we had made it clear that we wanted to make content in the movies, not just hardware and software. Yes, we're willing to pay our way by building hardware and software. We're good at that too, but we want to be in the movies. It wasn't clear to him. There was only one creator there. It was George Lucas. Mistakenly, I thought we were there to be in his movies, so I started hiring the best computer graphics experts I could find. they were willing to come. Everybody wanted to be in the movies. That's exciting. I put together this world-class team. They never showed up. George never showed up. Finally, I said, oh my gosh, he doesn't get it. He doesn't understand who he has here. About that time, Paramount Pictures came to Lucasfilm to have their special effects executed, and they wanted to put computer graphics in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. So this is not one of George's movies, this is Paramount's movie. And the producers brought me over and showed me what they had in mind, and I said, do you know what we can do with computers in this day and age? And, no. I said, I'll tell you what, I know what your story needs are. Let me go and think about this overnight, and I'll come back tomorrow with a shot that we can actually execute in this day and age. And he said, okay. And I said, by the way, we can't do movie resolution yet. This is still the early days. We can only do video resolution. And they said, fine, that's good, because what you're doing, we're showing a video demonstration to Captain Spock.
Yeah.
No, I'm forgetting my names. I can't believe it. Captain Kirk.
Yeah.
Okay, we're giving a video demonstration to Captain Kirk. So video is perfect. Great, we can do it. So sleepless night later, I show up with a very crude storyboard, which I still have. It's kind of amusingly crude, but landed the job. And I brought my team together and I said, great, we just got the big break. First time on the big screen in what will undoubtedly be a successful motion picture. This is what we've always been waiting for. And we'll do a great job of it as measured by Paramount and as measured by the audiences who see the movie. Everything will make perfect narrative sense. But what this really is a 60-second commercial to George Lucas. So he'll know what he has. I knew this one thing about George that guided me in what I did next. I knew that when he watches a movie, he never loses track of the cameraman. He knows exactly where the camera is and what it's doing all the time. Now, if a director's any good at all, you can't do that because he's sucked you into the emotion of the film. But George just could somehow look right through the emotion and watch the camera. So knowing that, I said to my team, I said, so we're going to put into this piece a camera move that'll blow George's socks right off him. It'll make narrative sense to the audience, but he'll know that it's a move that no real camera could even think about making. It'll turn upside down, flip, and do, it'll basically have 6 dimensions of freedom. And that's what we did. We put the shot in. It took us about 6 months to do this one 60-second piece, because that's how slow things were then. Day after the premiere, George steps foot in my office, just 1 foot in. He's kind of a shy man. And he said, great camera move. He was out of there. It worked. So he had us in his next movie, briefly, and more importantly, he told his best friend Steven Spielberg about us, and we were in Steven's next movie, and the word started to spread. But we still weren't doing character animation, which is our goal. That was special effects animation. So Ed and I, in 1983, on the plane back from SIGGRAPH, the annual conference that we go to, decided that at the next SIGGRAPH in 1984, we would announce to the world that we did character animation. And I started drawing the storyboards right on the plane. I still have the original sheets with the date on it and everything. It's still a crummy storyboard, but that was when it started. And I started executing that piece, and I was saved by another one of those amazing pieces of luck, hiring John Lasseter, this young animator, the best animator I still have run across, straight out of, he had been at Walt Disney. He'd been fired, much to our surprise. We didn't know he'd been fired, but he was available. He wanted to come work with us. Snapped him right up, and he basically saved my movie. I thought I could animate it, and now I look back as I didn't have a chance. I was not an animator. I thought I was, but I wasn't. I don't have the magic that an animator has. And that was the first piece with John Lasseter, who was basically the secret weapon that group of people became Pixar. George and Marcia got divorced shortly after this. And in California, that means half the fortune goes to either spouse, without question. I went to Ed and said, Ed Catmull, I said, George never really quite got who we are. He can't afford us anymore. He just lost half his fortune. He's going to fire us. And I said, that would be a sin. That's my Baptist upbringing kind of. And he's, I'm talking to a Mormon, so I said, that would be a sin to let this world-class group of creative computer graphicists disperse. Let's start a company, I said, to make a home for them. Now that's two computer nerds talking to each other who didn't have a stick of business sense, right? Just nothing. Never thought about it. And he said, okay. And we went across the street to a bookstore and bought four How to Start Company books. And we did it. Long story short, we did it. The hard part being, what's the company going to do? Because by that time we knew Moore's Law needed to go through another order of magnitude. The reason I knew that is because a Japanese company had come to us. I mentioned the Monkey movie the other day. Had come to us to do Monkey. And that project failed because I computed what the cost should be, and we just weren't in the ballpark yet. We needed another Moore's Law cycle. So what are we going to do for 5 years? Well, we can build hardware. We had a prototype we built for George. We'll turn that into a product and sell that. And that'll support us for 5 years, and then Moore's Law will get there and something will happen, right? We went through 45 funders who all said no, 35 venture capital firms, 10 large corporations. General Motors almost closed the deal with us. This is H. Ross Perot's branch of General Motors. About the only person I can imagine worse than Steve Jobs turned out to be. It didn't happen. It fell through. Ed and I are frantic because everybody's at the end of their tether. We tried 45 different possibilities. On the way back from the failed General Motors negotiation, we decided to call up Steve Jobs and say, Steve, just make that same offer again you made before. He had come through early in this financing game, and he asked me, Ed and me, to come down to his mansion in Woodside, California. I remember sitting out on the grass there, and Steve, who had been kicked out of Apple recently, said, what I want to do next is buy you guys from George Lucas and run you. And we went, no, we want to run our own company, but we'll take your money. And he said, okay. But he ran a number by that was so low. It was like 1/3 of what General Motors was offering. And it looked like the General Motors deal was done, that he basically got laughed out of the Lucasfilm office. So the story is that we came back from the failed General Motors negotiations to let's call Steve and say, make exactly that same offer again. He did. It worked this time. And that's how Steve Jobs became our venture capitalist. The myth is that he spread was that he bought us, but he did not buy us. He funded us in the good old standard Silicon Valley way. He was the majority shareholder with Series A preferred stock. And the employees, we employees on the rest of the stock. All the employees, I should add. We were very egalitarian. And for 5 years, we were a miserable hardware production company. Remember, Steve Jobs was a hardware guy, right? That's why he was interested. And we should have failed. We did fail 3-4 times during that 5 years. Because what's failure? When you can't pay the bills anymore. We got there 3 times. We would have been dead in any other circumstance other than having Steve Jobs as our investor. Steve had been kicked out of Apple. We were his first event after Apple. He could not withstand the embarrassment of his second thing being a failure. just couldn't. So he would write us a check and take away more equity. Until eventually, 5 years in, he did own the company, and none of us had anything in the company. But we were still alive, which is the whole point. I mean, we just weren't money people. This is our goal. And that's when Disney knocked on the door and said, okay, guys, let's make that movie. And that movie was Toy Story.
And the rest is history.
Yeah.
I think that's a very apt moment, perhaps, to leave it now. Who knows whether we'll do the rest of your life later. I think just one last question.
Sure.
I know that you are here as the accompanying spouse to Alison Opnick, and I know that you both of you are very close. Is there anything you'd like to say about Alison, just as a kind of postscript to this?
Well, Alison and I are the second marriage for both of us, and our joke is we had to have trial marriage in order to figure out how to do it right. We both believe we've done it right now. She's a companion of my life. We can talk about everything, and I think it's about co-intellectuality. We're both kind of on the same level, and so I'm half the time I'm her entourage, and the other half the time she's my entourage, and we get treated really well everywhere we go. She's really smart, really funny, really sexy, and we can, like I said, talk about anything, and we do. She's an expert on how children's brains work and how they develop from 0 to 5 years. It's probably a subject that more people should know more about. And one of the things that's happened here in Cambridge is that she has been, all the deep learning, machine learning organizations in England have been talking to her because they are suddenly interested in how do children do this. Seems like, basically children are way ahead of the machines at this point, but it's right that those two groups should be talking to each other. Yeah.
When you said that last remark, it made me think one more question. Children are way ahead of machines, and you talked earlier about artificial intelligence. Do you think, depending on how you define intelligence, machines can or will ever be intelligent in the way human beings are?
Well, this is the question, isn't it? Here's what I believe. I believe that I'm a machine. There are no secret forces. We now understand the structure of the universe, what different pieces of matter are and the different forces at work. I believe you're a machine. That each of us is a machine. And therefore, I believe there is an answer about how it works. I've been searching all my life for the answers. How does this machine work? And I don't feel very much closer now than I did 50 years ago when I first started asking the question seriously. Maybe it's something you referred to earlier. Maybe it's one of those things that when we get there, we won't be able to understand it. So, yeah. I guess I don't believe that. I think, look, I'm operating in the world right now, and you are too. There's nothing magical in my belief system anyhow, so there must be an explanation for it all. Why it's so hard to get at is still puzzling me. I don't find that inconsistent with a sense of awe. If this machine has awe, then we should be able to have a machine that's full of awe. I mean, that seems to be a consequence somehow or another. And evil and all those things. The greatest inspiration of all, of course, is the children. They come along quite regularly, and they're these freshly minted buses. And within a couple of years, they've figured us out. What's going on just through their senses, they figured out what's going on inside Grandpa's brain. How? That's awesome. Well, they're little finite enclosures, and they've got machines that we think we kind of understand, except that brain. It's still so complex we don't really know it yet. although we're getting closer and closer all the time. I see each one of those little critters as another example that somebody's figured out how it works, right? It's built into the genes, and that's a machine. But it is a mystery to me why it's been so hard. Could it be that our measurement, as we increase the resolution of our measuring devices, we learn a lot more, like the Hubble telescope has taught us amazing things about the universe that we didn't know before, just because we could see better. And we're now down to seeing individual synapses in the brain. I don't know how many of them we can see at a time. Probably not very many, but sooner or later, maybe we'll actually be able to measure at the high enough resolution to figure out what parts of this machine are doing, and be able to go from there. I know everybody says, and therefore it'll emerge, but I don't buy this emergence. To me, it's like the second coming. No, that's not. You can't use that as an explanation.
I think that's probably a very nice Baptist point at which to end.
Yeah, Baptist point, very right.